The first gunshot rang out just as Margaret Dawson set the last of her father's pocket watches into the velvet-lined case, shattering the window and sending glass cascading across the polished wooden floor of the train compartment. It was October 1879, and the Southern Pacific Railroad's newest route through the harsh Arizona Territory was about to witness a tragedy that would forever alter the course of one woman's life. Everybody down. The conductor's voice thundered through the passenger car moments before the screeching of metal against metal signaled the train's emergency stop. Margaret, 24 years old and traveling alone for the first time since her father's passing, instinctively dropped to the floor, her heart hammering against her ribs as more gunshots peppered the air. The black mourning dress she wore blended with the shadows beneath her seat as she clutched her father's watches, her inheritance and livelihood, to her chest. "This is a robbery," a gruff voice announced as boot heels stomped through the passenger car. "Nobody be a hero, and nobody gets hurt." 5 men with bandanas pulled over their faces moved methodically through the car, their revolvers trained on terrified passengers. A tall man with cold blue eyes visible above his mask stopped at Margaret's compartment, yanking open the sliding door. Well, what do we have here?" he drawled, noticing the watches clutched in her trembling hands. "Those look mighty valuable, miss." "Please," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible over the frightened whimpers of other passengers. "These were my father's. They're all I have left of him." The man's eyes narrowed. "Hand them over, and you won't join him just yet." Something in Margaret snapped. Perhaps it was grief over her father, or the indignity of losing the last connection to the man who had raised her alone after her mother's death. Whatever the reason, she found herself on her feet, backing away from the robber. "No," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. The man's eyes darkened. "Bad choice, lady." What happened next occurred in a blur of motion. Margaret lunged for the emergency exit, the case of watches still clutched to her chest. A sharp pain exploded in her shoulder as a bullet tore through flesh. The force sent her stumbling backward, crashing through the partially broken window and into the empty air beyond. The last thing Margaret remembered was falling, the Arizona desert rushing up to meet her, and the distant sound of the train pulling away, carrying with it any hope of rescue. Hours passed, or perhaps it was days. Time lost all meaning as Margaret drifted in and out of consciousness, the relentless sun beating down on her prone form. Her black dress absorbed the heat, turning the fabric into a torture device that seemed determined to cook her alive. The bullet wound in her shoulder had stopped bleeding, but infection was setting in, evident in the fever that made her skin burn hotter than the desert sand beneath her. She dreamed of water, of her father's workshop filled with the gentle ticking of dozens of timepieces, of a life that seemed increasingly distant. Death, she thought with strange clarity during one of her lucid moments, was not as frightening as she had imagined. It was simply a letting go, like falling asleep after a long, exhausting day. Margaret had accepted her fate when the rhythmic sound of hoofbeats penetrated her consciousness. She struggled to open her eyes, certain she was hallucinating. A tall figure on horseback appeared against the setting sun, the silhouette reminiscent of those dime novel heroes her father had occasionally brought home for her. "Madam," a deep voice called out. "My God, are you alive?" Strong arms lifted her from the ground, and Margaret caught a glimpse of concerned green eyes beneath the brim of a dusty cowboy hat before darkness claimed her once more. When Margaret next opened her eyes, she was lying on a bed softer than anything she'd felt in weeks of travel. A cool cloth rested on her forehead, and the burning in her shoulder had subsided to a dull throb. Sunlight streamed through a nearby window, illuminating a simple but clean room. "You're awake," that same deep voice observed, and Margaret turned her head to find a man seated in a chair beside the bed. He was perhaps 30, with sun-weathered skin and sandy brown hair that curled slightly at his collar. His eyes, she noted, were indeed as green as she'd remembered. "I wasn't sure you'd make it through the night." "Where am I?" Margaret asked, her voice a painful rasp. "My ranch, about 15 miles outside of Walla Walla, Washington Territory," he replied, reaching for a glass of water on the bedside table. "Name's Adam Ainsworth. Found you half dead by the railroad tracks yesterday evening." He helped her lift her head enough to take a sip of water. "You've got a nasty gunshot wound, madam, and you were burning up with fever. Doc Miller stitched you up as best he could." Margaret tried to sit up, then gasped as pain shot through her shoulder. "The watches," she said urgently. "Did you find a case of pocket watches?" Adam's expression softened with regret. "I'm afraid not, madam. Just you and that torn-up carpetbag." The reality of her situation hit Margaret like a physical blow. She was alive, yes, but thousands of miles from home, robbed of her inheritance, and now indebted to a stranger. Tears welled in her eyes before she could stop them. "I'm sorry," she whispered, both for her emotional display and for the burden she must now be. "I don't know how I'll repay you for your kindness." Adam shook his head firmly. "There's nothing to repay, Miss Dawson," she supplied. "Margaret Dawson." "Miss Dawson," he continued, "I couldn't very well leave you to die out there. Now you should rest. Your body's been through hell, begging your pardon for the language." As he stood to leave, Margaret noticed how tall he was, filling the doorframe of the modest bedroom. "Mr. Ainsworth," she called, stopping him. "Thank you for saving my life." The corner of his mouth lifted in a small smile. "Call me Adam," he said. And then he was gone, leaving Margaret alone with her thoughts and the ticking of a clock on the wall that painfully reminded her of all she had lost. The next few days passed in a fog of pain medication and fitful sleep. Margaret learned that she was staying in Adam's own bedroom while he slept in the bunkhouse with his ranch hands. The ranch, she gathered from snippets of conversation between Adam and his housekeeper, Mrs. Ramirez, was modestly successful, raising cattle and horses on the fertile land near the Walla Walla River. By the 5th day, Margaret insisted on getting out of bed. Mrs. Ramirez, a plump Mexican woman with kind eyes and firm hands, helped her dress in a simple cotton dress that belonged to Adam's late sister. "It is too big," Mrs. Ramirez observed, cinching the waist with a belt, "but it will do until we can make you something proper, yes." Margaret's throat tightened at the woman's casual assumption that she would be staying long enough to warrant new clothing. "I don't want to impose," she said quietly. "Once I'm well enough, I should find work in town and nonsense," Mrs. Ramirez interrupted, her accent thickening with emotion. "Senor Adam, he says you stay as long as needed. Now let us go downstairs. He will be happy to see you up and about." The main floor of the ranch house was simply furnished but comfortable, with a large stone fireplace dominating the sitting room and well-worn leather furniture that spoke of practical use rather than fashion. Adam wasn't there, but through the windows, Margaret could see men working in the corral, breaking what appeared to be a particularly spirited Mustang. She watched, transfixed, as Adam entered the corral, speaking softly to the nervous animal. His movements were confident but gentle, his patience evident even from a distance. The horse eventually allowed him to approach, nuzzling against his outstretched hand. "He has a way with wild things," Mrs. Ramirez said, appearing at Margaret's side with a cup of tea. "Animals, people, they trust him." Margaret accepted the tea gratefully. "He seems like a good man." "The best," Mrs. Ramirez agreed firmly, "but lonely. Since his parents died 5 years ago, it has been just work, work, work. No time for courting or dances or anything young men should enjoy. She gave Margaret a meaningful look that made her cheeks warm. Mrs. Ramirez, the older woman, patted her arm. Just observation, Nina. Now sit, rest. I will make lunch. Margaret spent the afternoon on the porch, soaking in the late autumn sunshine and watching the ranch operations with growing interest. Adam approached as the sun began its descent, wiping his brow with a bandana. "It's good to see you up," he said, settling into the chair beside her. "How's the shoulder?" "Better," Margaret replied honestly. "Dr. Miller said I was fortunate the bullet went straight through, missing anything vital." Adam nodded, his expression turning serious. "Miss Dawson, I hope you don't mind, but I took the liberty of sending a telegram to the railroad company and the territorial marshal about what happened to you. They're already hunting the gang responsible." Margaret felt a surge of gratitude mixed with a strange sense of dread. "Thank you. Though I doubt I'll ever see those watches again." "Were they very valuable, monetarily?" "Some were, yes. My father was a master watchmaker in Philadelphia. When he died 3 months ago, I discovered he had left significant debts." Margaret's fingers twisted in her borrowed skirt. "The business had to be sold, but the watches were mine to keep. I was traveling to San Francisco to open my own shop with what remained." Adam's eyes held no pity, only understanding. "And now you find yourself in Washington territory with nothing." "Not nothing," Margaret corrected gently. "I'm alive, thanks to you." They sat in companionable silence as the sun sank lower, painting the rolling hills in shades of gold and amber. In the distance, a coyote called, its lonely cry echoing across the landscape. "It's beautiful here," Margaret observed. "Different from Philadelphia in every way imaginable, but beautiful." "Walla Walla's growing fast," Adam said. "Might not be San Francisco, but folks here need all sorts of services. I reckon a watchmaker might do well once the railroad brings more settlers." The implication that she might stay permanently both thrilled and terrified Margaret. "I wouldn't know where to begin," she confessed. "And I have no tools, no parts." "Well," Adam said, standing as Mrs. Ramirez rang the dinner bell, "you've got time to figure it all out. No one's rushing you off this ranch until you're good and ready to go." Over the following weeks, Margaret's strength returned, and with it came a determination to be useful. She couldn't ride yet, her shoulder still healing, but she insisted on helping Mrs. Ramirez with household tasks, learning to cook over a wood stove and preserve the last of the garden's harvest for winter. Adam often found reasons to be near the house during these times, bringing in firewood or checking on a repair that suddenly needed his attention. Margaret pretended not to notice how his gaze followed her, or how her own heart quickened when he entered a room. One evening in early December, as the first snow dusted the ground outside, Adam returned from town with a small wooden crate. "Early Christmas present," he explained, setting it on the kitchen table where Margaret was kneading bread dough. "Go on, open it." Inside, nestled in straw, lay a set of watchmaker's tools, delicate screwdrivers, tweezers, magnifying glasses, and more, all arranged in a leather roll. "Adam," Margaret breathed, running her fingers over the precision instruments. "How did you?" "Ordered them from Seattle last month," he said, looking pleased with her reaction. "They just arrived on yesterday's train. There's something else, too." From his pocket, he produced a tarnished silver pocket watch. "It was my grandfather's. Hasn't worked in years. Thought maybe you could practice on it if you wanted." Margaret took the watch, turning it over in her hands. It was a fine piece, despite its condition. "I'd be honored," she said, meeting his eyes. "Thank you. This means more than I can say." That night marked a turning point. With tools in hand, Margaret felt a piece of herself returning the skilled craftswoman, not just the helpless victim. She set up a small workbench in a corner of the sitting room, and in the evenings, she would work on Adam's grandfather's watch while he read aloud from a dog-eared copy of The Count of Monte Cristo. As Christmas approached, word spread through Walla Walla that a watchmaker had taken up residence at the Ainsworth ranch. The first customer arrived 3 days before Christmas, the banker, Mr. Peterson, with his prized Waltham that had stopped keeping proper time. By New Year's, Margaret had repaired 5 watches and 1 clock, earning her first independent income since leaving Philadelphia. "You'll have a real business before spring," Adam observed one evening as they sat by the fire, snow falling heavily outside. "Folks are already asking when you'll open a proper shop in town." Margaret set aside her work, suddenly nervous. "I've been thinking about that," she admitted. "About the future." Adam waited, his expression guarded but hopeful. "I can't stay here forever," she continued carefully. "I've imposed on your hospitality for too long already." "It's no imposition," Adam said quickly. "Mrs. Ramirez says the house hasn't felt this alive in years." Margaret smiled. "Even so, I need to find my own place soon. Mrs. Wilson mentioned a room above the millinery shop that's available for rent." A shadow crossed Adam's face. "I see," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "If that's what you want." "It's not about what I want," Margaret explained, frustrated that she couldn't properly express her feelings. "It's about what's proper. A single woman living in a bachelor's home. People talk, Adam." "Let them talk," he said dismissively. "What do I care for gossip?" "I care," Margaret insisted. "Your reputation in this community is important. I won't be the cause of whispers and sideways glances when you deserve only respect." Adam was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. Finally, he stood, crossing to the window to watch the falling snow. "There's another solution," he said without turning around. "One that would silence the gossips and give you every right to stay here." Margaret's heart began to race. "Adam." He turned then, his expression more vulnerable than she'd ever seen it. "I know it hasn't been long, and maybe I'm a fool for speaking so soon, but life out here has taught me not to waste time when something matters." He took a deep breath. "I care for you, Margaret, more than I thought possible after knowing someone such a short while. If you felt even a fraction of the same, maybe we could." A pounding at the door interrupted his words, followed by Mrs. Ramirez's hurried footsteps across the foyer. "Señor Adam," she called, her voice tight with worry. "It is Miguel from the south pasture. The cattle broke through the fence in the storm. They are scattered." The moment shattered. Adam's expression changed instantly from vulnerable suitor to capable rancher. "I'll be right there," he called, already reaching for his coat. To Margaret, he said, "We'll continue this conversation when I return. Please think about what I was trying to say." Before she could respond, he was gone, swallowed by the swirling snow and the crisis that demanded his attention. The blizzard raged for 3 days, trapping everyone at the ranch house except Adam and his men, who fought through the elements to save as many cattle as possible. Margaret paced the floors, staring out at the white wasteland, imagining all the terrible fates that might have befallen them. On the morning of the 4th day, the storm finally broke. The sun emerged, blindingly bright against the pristine snow. Margaret was helping Mrs. Ramirez prepare a large pot of stew for the returning men when hoofbeats announced their arrival. She rushed to the door, her heart in her throat, only to stop short at the sight that greeted her. Adam was leading the group, his face gaunt with exhaustion, his left arm bound in a makeshift sling. Behind him, 4 of his ranch hands rode slowly, heads bowed in defeat. "What happened?" Margaret asked, hurrying down the porch steps despite the deep snow. Adam dismounted stiffly, his normally fluid movements hampered by pain and fatigue. "Lost about a third of the herd," he said grimly. "Found most of them frozen in the creek bottom, and Davis." His voice caught. "Davis didn't make it. His horse stumbled in a drift by the time we found him." Margaret helped him inside, her own concerns forgotten in the face of his loss. The ranch hands followed, bringing with them the body of their friend, wrapped in a blanket and tied to his saddle. The next days were a blur of grief and practical matters. Davis was buried in the small cemetery on the edge of the ranch property, beside Adam's parents and sister. The surviving cattle were rounded up and brought closer to the barn where they could be fed more easily until spring grass emerged. Adam's injury, a dislocated shoulder suffered while trying to rescue Davis, kept him close to the house, his frustration at his forced inactivity evident in his restless pacing and sharp comments. Margaret gave him space, understanding that his grief needed time to breathe. One evening in late January, as winter maintained its grip on the land, Adam found Margaret in the kitchen, preparing herbs for drying. "I owe you an apology," he said without preamble. "I've been poor company these past weeks." Margaret shook her head. "You lost a friend and a significant portion of your livelihood in one night, Adam. No one expects you to be cheerful." "Even so," he insisted, taking a seat at the table, "I've been dwelling on what can't be changed instead of what can." He hesitated, then continued more softly. "We never finished our conversation from before the storm." Margaret's hand stilled over her work. "I thought perhaps you'd reconsidered what you were going to say." "Not for a moment," Adam said firmly. "If anything, losing Davis reminded me how fragile life is out here, how important it is to speak truth while we can." He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "I was trying to ask if you might consider becoming my wife, Margaret." Despite having suspected this was coming, Margaret still felt unprepared for the rush of emotion his words provoked. "Adam, before you answer," he continued quickly, "I know we haven't known each other long. I know you didn't choose to come here and that San Francisco might still call to you. But I believe we could build something good together. The ranch needs a woman's touch, and you've already proven how capable you are. As for your watchmaking, there's space in town for a proper shop if that's what you want, or we could convert the old study here." Margaret looked at their joined hands, his tanned and calloused from years of ranch work, hers pale and nimble from manipulating tiny watch parts. Such different lives they had led. "When I was lying in the desert," she said slowly, "certain I was dying, my biggest regret was all the things I hadn't done, the risks I hadn't taken." She met his anxious gaze. "I don't want to live safely anymore, Adam. I want to live fully, even if that means facing the unknown." His expression was cautiously hopeful. "Is that a yes?" "It's a yes," Margaret confirmed, a smile spreading across her face. "I'll marry you, Adam Ainsworth." The kiss that followed sealed their commitment, tender yet filled with promise. When they finally broke apart, Adam rested his forehead against hers. "I thought I was just saving a stranger that day," he murmured. "I had no idea I was finding my future." February brought a brief thaw, turning the ranch roads to mud, but allowing for a trip into Walla Walla to announce their engagement and begin preparations for a spring wedding. The townspeople received the news with varying degrees of surprise and delight. Surprise that the confirmed bachelor, Adam Ainsworth, was finally settling down. Delight that the skilled watchmaker would be staying permanently. Margaret used some of her earnings to purchase fabric for a simple wedding dress, and Mrs. Ramirez insisted on helping with the sewing, her dark eyes misty with emotion as she took measurements. "I told you he had good heart," the older woman said smugly. "Did I not say this?" Margaret laughed. "You did. though I doubt even you could have predicted how quickly things would progress." Mrs. Ramirez shrugged. "The heart knows what it wants, Nina. Time is just a number like on your watches." As Margaret settled into her new role as Adam's fiancée, letters began arriving from the territorial marshal about the train robbery investigation. 3 of the gang members had been captured in Oregon, attempting another heist. They were awaiting trial in Portland, and Margaret would be called to testify once the trial date was set. "I should go," she told Adam one evening as they reviewed the ranch's ledgers together. Since their engagement, he had insisted on including her in all aspects of the business. "Those men left me for dead. They would have killed others if not stopped." Adam frowned. "Portland's a long journey and those men are dangerous. What if their remaining partners try to silence you?" "I can't live in fear," Margaret said firmly. "Besides, there's something I need to know, whether they still have my father's watches or if those are lost forever." Adam recognized the determination in her voice and nodded reluctantly. "Then we'll go together. The ranch can spare us for a week or 2. The trial was set for the first week of March. Margaret and Adam made the journey to Portland, a bustling city that reminded her painfully of the eastern home she'd left behind. They secured rooms in a reputable hotel near the courthouse, and Margaret spent the evening before her testimony reviewing what she remembered of that terrible day. The courthouse was imposing, all marble columns and high ceilings designed to make ordinary citizens feel the weight of the law. Margaret sat rigidly on the witness stand, her eyes never wavering from the 3 men in the dock, even when she identified the leader, James "Blackjack" Turner, as the one who had shot her and pushed her from the train. "And you are certain it was this man?" the prosecutor asked, pointing to Turner. "Absolutely certain," Margaret replied. "His eyes, I would know them anywhere." Turner glared at her with those same cold blue eyes, his mouth twisted in a sneer that suggested he was imagining her death all over again. Margaret refused to look away, drawing strength from Adam's presence in the gallery. When cross-examination began, Turner's defense attorney tried to undermine her testimony by suggesting her memory had been compromised by trauma and fever. "Miss Dawson, you yourself admit you were drifting in and out of consciousness after your unfortunate fall from the train," the lawyer said condescendingly. "Isn't it possible you're mistaken about who shot you? Perhaps it was another passenger attempting to stop the robbery." Margaret's voice remained steady. "No, sir. It was Mr. Turner who demanded my father's watches. It was Mr. Turner who threatened my life when I refused, and it was most certainly Mr. Turner who shot me when I tried to escape." She paused, then added, "I may have been dying in that desert, but I knew exactly who put me there." The jury took less than 2 hours to return a guilty verdict for all 3 men. The judge sentenced them to 20 years of hard labor, commenting specifically on the callous treatment of a lady traveling alone. As the courtroom emptied, the prosecutor approached Margaret and Adam. "Miss Dawson, we recovered some items when we arrested these men," he said, producing a small cloth bag. "I believe these belong to you." With trembling hands, Margaret opened the bag to find 3 of her father's pocket watches, not all of them, but the most valuable ones, including her personal favorite, a delicate lady's pendant watch with her mother's portrait inside the case. "Thank you," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "I never thought I'd see these again." Outside the courthouse, Adam took her hand as they descended the steps. "Are you all right?" Margaret nodded, clutching the recovered watches. "Better than all right, I feel. Free somehow. As if the last piece of my old life has been returned just so I can properly say goodbye to it. And the rest of the watches? Gone," she said simply. But these three, especially this one with my mother's portrait, these were the ones that mattered most. She smiled up at him. Besides, I have a new life waiting for me in Walla Walla, one I never could have imagined 6 months ago. They were married on the first day of April 1880, with the apple trees on the ranch just beginning to blossom. The ceremony was simple but joyful, held in the town church with most of Walla Walla in attendance. Margaret wore a dress of pale blue silk, rejecting the traditional white since this was, as she told Mrs. Ramirez with a wink, a new beginning, not a first beginning. Adam's wedding gift to her was the deed to a small storefront on Main Street, where Margaret could establish her watchmaking business proper. Her gift to him was his grandfather's watch, now restored to perfect working order and engraved inside with their wedding date. Spring brought new life to the ranch, calves in the pastures, fresh paint on the house, and Margaret's careful touch evident in the flower beds that now lined the walkway. The town's newspaper ran a flattering article about Walla Walla's most fortuitous love story, recounting how tragedy had led to triumph when a dying woman was rescued by a passing cowboy. "They've made us sound like characters from a dime novel," Margaret laughed as they read the article together over breakfast. "Next, they'll be saying you fought off a mountain lion with your bare hands to save me." Adam grinned. "Give them time. By our first anniversary, I'll have rescued you from an entire band of outlaws." As spring turned to summer, Margaret divided her time between her growing watch repair business and learning the rhythms of ranch life. Adam taught her to ride, his patience as evident with her as it was with his horses. She proved a quick study, soon accompanying him on his daily rounds of the property. One evening in late July, as they sat on the porch watching a spectacular sunset paint the wheat fields gold, Margaret took Adam's hand and placed it gently on her stomach. "I've been wondering when you might notice," she said softly. "Your son or daughter should arrive sometime in February." Adam's expression transformed from confusion to wonder to unbridled joy in the span of seconds. "A baby? You're certain?" "As certain as Dr. Miller could make me this morning," Margaret confirmed, laughing as Adam lifted her from her chair and spun her around, mindful of her still healing shoulder. "Mrs. Ramirez will be ecstatic," he said, setting her back on her feet but keeping his arms around her. "She's been leaving hints about cradles and baby blankets for weeks now. I thought she was just being hopeful." "She knew before I did, I think," Margaret admitted. "She's been making me drink special tea for morning sickness since June." That night, lying in bed with Adam's protective hand resting on her still flat stomach, Margaret reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. From the brink of death in the Arizona desert to the threshold of new life in the rolling hills of Washington Territory, it was almost too much to comprehend. "What are you thinking?" Adam murmured sleepily beside her. "That sometimes the worst moments of our lives can lead us to the best," she replied, turning to face him in the moonlight that streamed through their bedroom window. "If those men hadn't robbed me, if you hadn't found me." Adam's arms tightened around her. "I believe we would have found each other somehow," he said with conviction. "Some things are just meant to be." Margaret touched his face, memorizing the contours of it with her fingertips. "Like a watchmaker and a cowboy." "Exactly like that," he agreed, kissing her palm. "The most unlikely combination that turned out to be absolutely perfect." As autumn painted the landscape in vibrant hues, Margaret's pregnancy progressed smoothly. Her watch shop thrived, with customers coming from as far as Spokane to have their precious timepieces repaired by the lady watchmaker with the miracle story, as she was now known throughout the territory. Adam, meanwhile, expanded the ranch operations, investing in better breeding stock and hiring additional hands to manage the growing herd. The losses from the previous winter's blizzard were slowly being recouped, and the future of Ainsworth Ranch looked promising. In October, exactly 1 year after the train robbery that had nearly ended her life, Margaret received a telegram from Philadelphia. Her father's former business partner had tracked her down after learning she had survived. "He says the business is thriving," Margaret told Adam as they read the telegram together, "and that he's setting aside a percentage of the profits for me, as my father would have wanted. There's quite a sum accumulated already." Adam whistled low. "That's unexpected good fortune." "What will you do with it?" Margaret didn't hesitate. "Invest in our future in the ranch, in the shop, in our child's education someday." She rested her hands on her now prominent belly. "This is my home now. Everything I want is right here." The winter of 1880-1881 was milder than the previous year, with manageable snowfall and fewer dangerous storms. Margaret's pregnancy continued without complications, though Dr. Miller insisted she reduce her hours at the shop as her February due date approached. On a clear, cold morning in early February, Margaret went into labor just as dawn broke over the eastern hills. Mrs. Ramirez sent one of the ranch hands racing for Dr. Miller while she prepared the bedroom and boiled water for the delivery. Adam paced the hallway outside, wincing with each of Margaret's cries, praying with an intensity he hadn't felt since the night he found her in the desert. 12 hours later, Dr. Miller emerged from the bedroom with a broad smile. "Congratulations, Mr. Ainsworth," he announced. "You have a healthy son." Adam's legs nearly buckled with relief and joy. He entered the bedroom to find Margaret propped up on pillows, her face exhausted but radiant as she cradled a small bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. "Meet your son," she said, her voice hoarse from exertion. "I thought we might name him David after your father." Adam sat carefully on the edge of the bed, tentatively touching the downy head of his newborn son. "David Ainsworth," he agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "It's perfect." As spring returned to the land once more, the Ainsworth family settled into a new rhythm. Margaret reopened her watch shop on a limited schedule, bringing baby David with her in a cradle behind the counter. Customers cooed over the infant while Margaret worked, her skilled hands never missing a beat, despite the occasional interruption to feed or comfort her son. Adam divided his time between ranch work and helping with the baby, proudly carrying David around the property, introducing him to horses and cattle with the same earnest explanations he would give an adult. The ranch hands teased him good-naturedly about how quickly the fearless cowboy had been tamed by a tiny, helpless infant. In June, as David approached his 4th month, a stranger arrived at the watch shop just as Margaret was preparing to close for the day. He was well-dressed but travel-worn, with a familiar intensity in his eyes that immediately put Margaret on alert. "Mrs. Ainsworth?" he inquired, removing his hat. "Formerly Miss Margaret Dawson." Margaret nodded cautiously, instinctively moving to stand between the stranger and David's cradle. "Yes, that's me. How may I help you?" The man produced a badge from his vest pocket. "Thomas Reynolds, Pinkerton Detective Agency. I've been tracking the remaining members of the Turner gang for the past year." He glanced at the sleeping baby. "Is your husband available?" "I have information regarding the men who robbed and attempted to murder you." Adam was summoned from the ranch, arriving at the shop within the hour, his expression grim as he shook Reynolds's hand. Together, they sat at Margaret's work table as the detective explained his presence. "We've apprehended William Sorensen, Turner's right-hand man," Reynolds said. "He was hiding in a mining camp in Colorado. During his interrogation, he revealed something I thought you should know." He paused, his gaze shifting between Adam and Margaret, The robbery wasn't random. Your father's watches were specifically targeted. Margaret's hand flew to her throat. What? How is that possible? According to Sorensen, Turner had connections in Philadelphia, someone who knew about your father's collection and your plans to travel west with it. Reynolds pulled out a notebook. Does the name Harrison Blake mean anything to you? The color drained from Margaret's face. He was my father's business partner before the current one. They had a falling out about 2 years ago. She shook her head in disbelief. Are you saying Blake arranged the robbery? Reynolds nodded grimly. Sorensen claims Blake provided information about your travel schedule and the value of the watches. In return, he was to receive a portion of the proceeds from their sale. Adam's jaw clenched. So Margaret's near death wasn't just collateral damage in a robbery, it was part of a deliberate plan by someone who knew her. I'm afraid so, Reynolds confirmed. Blake apparently told them that eliminating any witnesses would be preferable. The shock of this revelation left Margaret trembling. All this time, she had considered the robbery an unfortunate twist of fate, a random act of violence that had, paradoxically, led her to happiness. To learn that someone from her past had orchestrated it, had essentially marked her for death, was almost too much to process. Have you arrested Blake? Adam asked, his arm protectively around Margaret's shoulders. Reynolds shook his head. Not yet. He fled Philadelphia shortly after Turner's trial made the newspapers. We believe he's somewhere in Europe now. The detective leaned forward earnestly. But we will find him, Mrs. Ainsworth. The Pinkerton Agency doesn't give up on cases like this. After Reynolds departed, promising to keep them informed of any developments, Margaret sat in stunned silence, mechanically rocking David's cradle with one foot. I can't believe Harrison would do such a thing, she finally said. He was at our dinner table so many times. He gave me a brooch for my 18th birthday. Adam took her hands in his. Some men value money above all else, he said quietly. But look at what his greed unwittingly gave you: a new life, a family, a future far from Philadelphia. Margaret managed a weak smile. You always find the silver lining, don't you? It's the only way to survive out here, Adam replied, kissing her forehead. Now let's go home. Tomorrow will look brighter. He was right, as he so often was about such things. The next morning, as Margaret nursed David while watching the sun rise over the eastern hills of their ranch, the shock of Reynolds's revelation began to fade. In its place came a steely determination not to let Harrison Blake's betrayal cast a shadow over the life she had built. When Adam found her on the porch an hour later, she had reached a decision. I want to use some of the money from the Philadelphia shop to expand my business here, she announced. Not just watch repairs anymore, but a full jewelry store. Walla Walla is growing. People will want fine things to mark their special occasions. Adam studied her face, recognizing the resolved set of her jaw. Are you sure? You already have your hands full with David and the shop as it is. I'll hire help, Margaret said decisively. Perhaps that Simmons girl who just finished school. She has nimble fingers and a good eye for detail. She bounced David gently on her knee. I refuse to let fear of the past dictate my future, Adam. Blake tried to have me killed for pocket watches. The best revenge is to build something so much greater than what he tried to take from me. By the following spring, Ainsworth Fine Watches and Jewelry had become one of the most respected establishments in Walla Walla. Margaret employed 2 assistants, Sarah Simmons for the jewelry side of the business, and a retired railroad watchmaker named Harold Jenkins, who was delighted to pass his knowledge on to the next generation. David grew into a sturdy toddler with his father's green eyes and his mother's determined spirit. He tottered around the shop when Margaret brought him with her, charming customers with his sunny disposition, and fascination with anything that ticked or chimed. On the ranch, prosperity continued. Adam's breeding program produced cattle that commanded premium prices at market, and his horse training skills became renowned throughout the territory. They built a larger house to accommodate their growing success and, hopefully, their growing family. In the summer of 1883, Margaret received another telegram from Pinkerton Detective Reynolds. Harrison Blake had been apprehended in London and was being extradited to face charges in the United States. Would Mrs. Ainsworth be willing to testify at his trial in New York? "You don't have to go," Adam said as they discussed the telegram over dinner. "You've built a new life here. Why dredge up the past?" Margaret considered his words carefully. "If I don't testify, Blake might escape justice. Other people could be hurt by his schemes." She looked at David, now 2.5 and feeding himself with more enthusiasm than accuracy. "Besides, I want our children to know that their mother stands up for what's right, no matter how difficult." Adam's eyebrows rose. "Children, is there something you're not telling me?" Margaret smiled mysteriously. "Dr. Miller confirmed it yesterday. This one should arrive in January." The journey to New York for Blake's trial was arduous but necessary. Margaret testified calmly, looking her former family friend directly in the eye as she recounted how his betrayal had nearly cost her life. Blake, once so confident and polished, seemed to age years during her testimony, his shoulders slumping further with each damning detail. The jury convicted him on all counts. As Blake was led away to begin his 20-year sentence, he paused before Margaret. "I never meant for you to be hurt," he said, his voice barely audible. "Just the watches. It was only ever about the watches." Margaret regarded him without pity. "You were willing to trade my life for gold and gears, Harrison. Remember that during your years in prison." She left the courthouse with her head high, ready to return to the life and family waiting for her in Washington Territory. Elizabeth Ainsworth was born on a snowy January morning in 1884, a delicate counterpoint to her boisterous brother. Margaret recovered quickly from the birth, eager to return to both motherhood and her thriving business. Adam, now the proud father of a matched set, as he jokingly called them, built a new cradle for Elizabeth with the same loving care he'd shown for David's. As the children grew, so did the ranch and the jewelry business. Margaret's reputation as both a watchmaker and a businesswoman spread throughout the Pacific Northwest. By 1888, she had opened a second store in Spokane, managed by her now trusted assistant Sarah, who had married a local banker. Adam expanded the ranch to nearly 3,000 acres, employing a dozen full-time hands and additional seasonal workers during roundups. The Ainsworth name became synonymous with quality in both cattle and horseflesh, with buyers coming from as far as California to purchase their stock. Through it all, Margaret never forgot how close she had come to death that October day in 1879. Each year on the anniversary of the train robbery, she and Adam would ride to a special spot on the ranch, a small hill overlooking the valley, where wildflowers bloomed in profusion during the spring. There, they would share a simple picnic and count their blessings. "You ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't found me that day?" Margaret asked during one such anniversary as they watched their children playing nearby, David now 9 and Elizabeth 5. Adam considered the question seriously. "Sometimes, I might still be that lonely rancher, working myself to exhaustion and never knowing what I was missing." He reached for her hand, the same gentle touch that had lifted her broken body from the desert sand nearly a decade earlier. "What about you? Do you ever miss the life you planned to have in San Francisco?" Margaret shook her head, watching as David helped Elizabeth climb a low-hanging branch of an old oak tree. That life was just a dream, a possibility. This, she gestured to encompass their children, the ranch, the town visible in the distance. This is real. This is everything I never knew I wanted until I found it. In 1890, as Washington achieved statehood, the Ainsworths celebrated their 10th wedding anniversary with a grand party that brought together friends, family, and business associates from throughout their lives. The mayor of Walla Walla presented them with a ceremonial key to the city, recognizing their contributions to the community's growth and prosperity. Margaret, now in her mid-30s and more confident than ever, gave a speech thanking the townspeople for accepting a half-dead stranger into their midst all those years ago. "Walla Walla didn't just give me a second chance at life," she told the gathered crowd. "It gave me a home, a purpose, and a love story that began with a gunshot but will end, many years from now, with the peaceful knowledge that everything worked out exactly as it should have." Later that evening, as the celebration wound down and their guests departed, Adam found Margaret standing on the porch of their home, gazing up at the star-filled sky. He joined her, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders against the autumn chill. "Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Ainsworth." Margaret leaned into his embrace, the solid warmth of him still a comfort after all these years. "I was just thinking about time," she said softly. "How it's both my profession and my greatest teacher. Time can change everything, turn strangers into lovers, enemies into distant memories, empty houses into homes filled with laughter." Adam nodded, understanding as always, and turned tragedy into the best kind of blessing. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching as a shooting star blazed across the heavens, a fleeting moment of brilliance in the vast expanse of night, much like the chance encounter that had changed both their lives forever. "I love you, Margaret," Adam said simply, the words worn smooth with use but no less heartfelt for their familiarity. "And I love you," she replied, turning in his arms to face him. "My cowboy, my rescuer, my heart." Above them, the stars continued their eternal dance, marking time in a universe where sometimes, against all odds, people find exactly where they're meant to be even if they have to nearly die to get there. As the children grew into teenagers and then young adults, the legend of how their parents met became a favorite family story, embellished slightly with each telling. David, who inherited his father's way with horses, would entertain ranch hands with the tale of how Adam had fought off coyotes to rescue the beautiful watchmaker. Elizabeth, more practical like her mother, would correct her brother's exaggerations while adding romantic details of her own. By the turn of the century, the Ainsworth Ranch had become one of the largest and most respected in the state. David, now 20, worked alongside his father, introducing modern farming techniques he'd learned during a year at an agricultural college in California. Elizabeth, 16 and already showing her mother's business acumen, spent afternoons at the jewelry store, learning to negotiate with suppliers and charm difficult customers. In 1904, as they celebrated their 24th wedding anniversary, Adam and Margaret took their first extended trip away from the ranch. Traveling by train, a mode of transportation Margaret had been reluctant to revisit for many years, to Philadelphia, where she could finally show her husband the city where she'd been born and raised. They visited her father's grave, now tended by his former business partner, who had maintained the small percentage of profits for Margaret all these years. The accumulated funds were substantial enough that Margaret decided to establish a scholarship at a local watchmaking school for women who wished to enter the trade. "Your father would be proud," Adam said as they left the cemetery. Not just of the scholarship, but of everything you've built." Margaret smiled, taking his arm as they walked through streets both familiar and strange after so many years away. "I think he would have liked you," she said. "He always said I needed someone steady to balance my impulses." Adam laughed. "Steady? The man who found you half dead in the desert and proposed marriage barely 3 months later." "The steadiest man I know," Margaret affirmed. "Not because you never take risks, but because you're always exactly who you are, no matter the circumstances." When they returned to Walla Walla, they found the town and their businesses thriving under their children's temporary management. David had successfully negotiated a new contract for the ranch's beef with a hotel chain in Seattle, while Elizabeth had designed a line of jewelry that captured the essence of the Washington landscape in silver and local stones. "I think we might be becoming obsolete," Adam joked as they reviewed the accomplishments of their absence. Margaret squeezed his hand. "Never obsolete, just transitioning to a new role." That role became clearer in 1906, when David announced his engagement to Catherine Miller, the doctor's daughter who had grown from a childhood playmate to the love of David's life. The wedding was held on the ranch, under the same apple trees where Adam and Margaret had exchanged their vows 26 years earlier. As Margaret watched her son pledge his life to Catherine, she couldn't help but reflect on the extraordinary chain of events that had led to this moment. If the train robbery had never happened, if Adam hadn't found her that day, David wouldn't exist. Catherine would have married someone else. The entire tapestry of interconnected lives would be completely different. "It's amazing, isn't it?" Adam murmured, reading her thoughts as he so often did. "How one moment can change everything that follows." Elizabeth married 3 years later, choosing a young lawyer named Thomas Bennett, who had moved to Walla Walla to establish a practice focused on helping small farmers and ranchers navigate the increasingly complex legal landscape of modern agriculture. Margaret approved wholeheartedly of her daughter's choice. Thomas reminded her of Adam in his quiet integrity and determination to do what was right. With both children married and building their own lives, Adam and Margaret found themselves entering a new phase of their relationship. They traveled more frequently, visiting parts of the country they had only read about. They delegated more responsibility at the ranch and the jewelry business, allowing them time to pursue shared interests like photography and gardening. In 1915, as war raged in Europe and America debated whether to join the conflict, Margaret celebrated her 60th birthday surrounded by family, not just Adam, David, Elizabeth, and their spouses, but also 5 grandchildren who adored their Nana Maggie and her seemingly magical ability to fix anything that ticked, clicked, or needed mending. 60 years, she marveled to Adam that night as they sat on their porch, watching fireflies dance in the summer twilight. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday that I was lying in that desert, certain my life was over before it had really begun." Adam, his hair now silver but his green eyes still bright and alert, took her hand in his. The decades had changed them. Both physically, Margaret's nimble fingers were beginning to show the first signs of arthritis, and Adam's back troubled him after long days on horseback, but the connection between them had only deepened with time. "I knew you were special the moment I found you," Adam said, "though I never could have imagined just how special." Margaret leaned her head on his shoulder, listening to the familiar sounds of their land at night, distant cattle lowing, the creaking of the windmill, the soft hooting of an owl hunting in the old oak grove. "We've had a good life, haven't we?" "The best," Adam agreed. "And plenty more years to come." He was right, though those years would bring challenges they couldn't have anticipated. World War I took their grandson James, David's eldest boy, who died on a French battlefield in 1918. The Spanish flu pandemic that followed claimed Mrs. Ramirez, who had been like a mother to Margaret for so many years. Through each sorrow, Adam and Margaret faced the future together, their bond unbroken by time or tragedy. When prosperity returned in the 1920s, they modernized the ranch with electricity and indoor plumbing, though Adam grumbled good-naturedly about newfangled inventions taking the character out of country living. Margaret finally retired from active management of her jewelry stores in 1925, at the age of 70. Her eyesight, so crucial to her work with tiny watch parts, was failing despite the strongest spectacles Dr. Miller's successor could prescribe. She trained her granddaughter Rebecca, Elizabeth's middle child, to take her place, recognizing in the young woman the same precision and patience that had made Margaret's own career so successful. Adam held on to the reins of the ranch a bit longer, but by 1928, at 79, he too was ready to step back and let David take full control of the operations. They moved from the main house to a smaller, more manageable cottage that Adam had built near the apple orchard, surrounded by Margaret's prized rose garden. It was there, in the peaceful twilight of their lives, that they celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary in 1930. The Great Depression was beginning to tighten its grip on the nation, but the Ainsworth family, thanks to generations of careful management and diversified interests, weathered the economic storm better than many. The celebration was smaller than their 25th anniversary had been, but no less meaningful. 4 generations gathered in the orchard: Adam and Margaret, their children and spouses, grandchildren ranging from their 20s to their teens, and 2 great-grandchildren, toddlers who brought fresh laughter to the ancient trees. As a gift, the family had commissioned a special clock for the cottage, its face inscribed with a message that brought tears to Margaret's eyes when she read it. Time brought you together. Love kept you that way. Adam, now using a cane but still standing straight and tall, raised a toast to his wife. 50 years ago, I found a dying woman in the desert and brought her home, he said, his voice wavering with emotion. What I didn't realize was that she was actually bringing me to life. He turned to Margaret, taking her hand as he had countless times before. Every tick of every clock since that day has been a gift, my love. Margaret, her once auburn hair now white as snow but her spirit undimmed, squeezed his hand in return. And every tick yet to come, she promised. They had 5 more years together before Adam passed peacefully in his sleep one winter morning in 1935. Margaret found him when she woke, his hand still reaching toward hers across the quilt they had shared for 55 years. She lived another 3 years, surrounded by family and the memories of a life well lived. Though physically diminished, her mind remained sharp, and she delighted in telling stories to her great-grandchildren about the old days, especially the tale of how a train robbery, meant to end her life, had instead given her everything worth living for. On a bright spring day in 1938, Margaret joined Adam in the family cemetery on the hill overlooking the ranch. She was laid to rest beside him under a simple headstone that bore both their names, their birth and death dates, and a single phrase that summarized their extraordinary journey. Found in the desert, home at last. The legend of Adam and Margaret Ainsworth lived on in Walla Walla for generations, a testament to the power of rescue, resilience, and love against all odds. Their descendants continued to operate both the ranch and the jewelry business well into the 21st century, guided by the principles and passion of the couple who had built a dynasty from the ashes of what should have been a tragedy. And somewhere in the vastness of time and space, perhaps two souls who found each other against impossible odds continued their dance, no longer bound by the ticking of clocks or the constraints of mortal life, but forever connected by a love that had truly conquered death itself.